lot of network, but my real focus has always been on the endpoint. And I've grown into this position where today I'm looking at how do we protect data on the endpoint, because if you look at data is the most important commodity that we have today in IT. I spent a number of years in IR teams, incident response. I used to have a go bag. I used to fly around the freaking world looking at porn. Don't ask. Long story. I'm also a director for B-Sides London, so if you guys come to B-Sides London, thanks for support. And also a chapter board member for ISA UK chapter. So this talk is about my experience. So if you saw my presentation last year, I told you about some stuff I was doing on the endpoint where I was generating a crap load of data. I mean, we're generating like gigabytes of data, potentially gigabytes, and hundreds of gigabytes of data per day. When you put that in the context of an enterprise, you've got like a whole lot of data, and it's like, how are you going to actually go through that data to find something? So that's when I started to look into threat hunting. So, I kind of consider it a little bit of a marketing label. So if you look at some of the companies that are actually pushing this out, they're talking about threat hunting and all this. SANS has picked it up as well. It's essentially, if you think about the IR process, is how do you identify things? When do you find things? Historically, we looked at indicators. We had alarms and things like that that would generate, and then we'd go out and do incident response. Today, incident response has become more of a, how do I dig through a crap load of logs and find something that's wrong? And that's what threat hunting really is all about. And that's what I'm going to try and explain, to show you what we're talking about and what they really mean by threat hunting, depending on, well, it's my vision. I've translated this into my vision, but I've actually regrouped. I did some research. I looked at all the different parties that are talking about threat hunting, what they're doing, and things like that. And the idea is that now that I know this, how do I implement this in a team that's actually going to go look through all this mountain of data and try to find things? And how can we do it better? So what is threat hunting? Well, threat hunting came about essentially because an infrastructure is opaque. So we have all these infrastructures. Sometimes the infrastructure doesn't have any boundaries anymore. We have services in the cloud. We have everything. So there's an opacity to the infrastructure that we don't really understand. We don't really see everything that we might want to see. And on the other hand, today you've got adversaries. We used to talk about script kiddies and things like that in the past. Nowadays, we have much more cunning adversaries, and they're going after one specific thing, and that's to somehow get at your data so they can do damage to your business. And they typically work the way that they're actually looking at the infrastructure, looking at your infrastructure, trying to compromise your infrastructure to then reuse that infrastructure against you. So they're coming in through different ways: social engineering, phishing attacks, spear phishing attacks, drive-bys, anything that you want. But ultimately, they're coming inside, they're ending up on the endpoints, and they're using the endpoints against you. I tell this to my customers all the time: you've probably already been compromised. Just deal with it, accept it, don't worry about it. I mean, find the thing, then you can get past the shock and awe. In practice, what is it really about? In practice, it's about really, you have analysts on one side, your side, and you have an adversary on the other. So it's a game of I'm defending and there's an attacker. We talk about red teams and blue teams. It's essentially that. But the adversary is extremely creative. It's extremely adaptive. They have nothing else to do all day. In most cases, in an organization, if you have an IR team, if you have analysts, they're busy doing a day job as well, right? They're busy taking care of the infrastructure. They're busy upgrading the infrastructure, analyzing, doing reports and things like that. The attacker, just all he does all day is think about new ways to get into your environment and to use your environment against you. The other thing too is you don't have any particular indicators. A lot of the solutions that we've been seeing on the market for the past few years talk about indicators of compromise. So they've defined certain patterns and certain things that they look for to tell you you've been compromised. In this situation, when an adversary is using the infrastructure against you, he's not doing anything in particular. I have cases where we've actually seen the adversary use old version of software to actually create an attack on the infrastructure. Say they'll use a PHP interpreter that they install on the machine, on the user's machine, to then run scripts to actually do things in the environment. And it works. Why? Because PHP doesn't trigger as an alarm, because it's a PHP interpreter. Why would you even bother? And it runs in user space. So what you're actually looking at is doing a deep analysis, like an incident response type analysis, from a central location of all your potentially compromised resources. And you need to do this because today we're not talking about anymore one compromised resource. One of the first things that most attackers do is they start to look at how they can move laterally, how they can attack more machines and get footprints into more of your machines. Why? Because the more footprint that they have, the longer they can stay in there and the more they can do. And it's a lot about finding what evades automatic detection. You'll still have, your team will probably still process alarms for things that get automatically detected by your firewalls, your next-gen AVs and things like that. But the truth of the matter is what they're actually looking for is what doesn't trigger an alarm. And there's a lot of things that don't trigger an alarm. PowerShell, for example. I saw our friend from India is here again talking about new PowerShell attack techniques. PowerShell is a really powerful tool, and the problem is it's everywhere. Yes, and literally everywhere now, because you can get it on the Mac as well, and Linux. So threat hunting actually is about understanding your environment and defining what is normal in your environment. Now this requires that your analysts actually understand and are able to clarify the patterns of what normal things are happening in your environment. So when there's a patch day for an application, they need to know that. They need to know what happens when they patch the applications, what triggers are going to happen, what kind of logs they're going to see, versus something that's not normal that will happen outside of time. You guys all heard about the Tesco attack this weekend, right? One of the big problems with the Tesco attack last weekend, the Tesco bank attack last weekend, is that the guys did it during the weekend. Why? Because they figured, well, nobody's really monitoring things on weekends, especially because resource constraints and costs and things like that. And they use normal techniques. So they looked like they were working on a normal day, but it was actually the weekend. That's what, and it's only when they started to look at movements of money that they actually figured out that they were being compromised. So what? Well, what you need to do, basically, when you're threat hunting is you're going to build a proactive footprint. So you're actually positioning yourself to build a kind of defense layer, right? So you're building an active wall to see, when you start to see things, you're going to move that wall into a position where you're going to look for more evidence for that specific attack, or you might actually block things, you might actually start to do incident response on that attack, and you might actually start to focus your attention on a specific area. You need to understand your infrastructure. So the infrastructure is an important part of this, right? You need to understand how it works. You need to know which systems are there, what applications, the configuration of the application. Typically what you do is you'll do a gap analysis. Now, doing that gap analysis, you can identify where the biggest holes are. So you're going to focus your attention on those holes. The advantage of this, when you're doing this, is your teams actually gain knowledge of what your infrastructure looks like and what's happening in your infrastructure. They're essentially building a pattern, and they're essentially building a knowledge base of what's going on. And they can identify those commonalities of business workflows. They can identify what's going on in the environment, what looks normal and what doesn't look normal. So they start to build this contextual knowledge and awareness. And that's really important for threat hunting. You need to have people that understand how the business works and what's a normal day look like in terms of the IT logs and whatever events are being generated. The other good thing is, because you usually have teams that are working 24/7, so they're working on phases or shifts, you typically end up documenting this stuff. So you're increasing the organizational knowledge, which is a really good thing, because once you start to increase your organizational knowledge, you're giving something back to the business. It's the IT business, but you're giving something back to the business, right? So you're kind of giving some kind of return on investment because you're putting this process into place. But, you're looking for things, right? The fact of the matter is that Hunting, you feel like, you know, the alien, the guy from Predators, but in reality, it's a really tough job. And you sit in front of a screen, and you end up banging your head against the desk a lot of times. Because sometimes you don't see anything, sometimes you do see things, and then going backwards to try and figure out what's going on can be really hard, because you find out that there's actually a gap in what you're actually capturing in terms of events and logs, and you're sitting there going, well, okay, hold on a second, how did they get in? Right? And that's the important part, because finding out and figuring out how they got in helps you actually build better defenses in the future. So to do this, you basically need tools. Well, that didn't build properly. The tools that you need typically are the logs, well, the things that you already have, like firewalls, IDSs, network devices. If you don't have them, you can use things like bro-IDS, passive DNS, auto-runs, PowerShell, WMI, so to gather all that information. SANS actually did a review of this, you know, and the top feeds that they see of people doing threat hunting really focus on IDS and firewall type things and DNS and network flow, right? If you look at the chart, those are the top 4 uses, events what people are looking for when they're doing threat hunting, which is interesting, but it's only a partial vision of your environment. If you think about your environment is a complex situation. You've got network, you've got endpoints, you've got mobile devices and things like that. So you actually need a lot more to do a proper vision of your environment and to actually capture things. But ultimately, it's all about logs. And as they say in war, it's 99% information. The more you know, the better you are off and the easier you're going to identify things. Typically, what you'll see is you'll pick up firewall logs. So from the firewall logs, you might look for unusual IP addresses. You might look for countries. You might look for IP addresses that don't really have anything to do with your business. So why is somebody, if you're in a bank, why is somebody going to an IP address in China that's focused on manufacturing? Look at your proxy logs too. Proxy logs, there's a lot of things you can look for. You can look for unusual traffic, like outbound 22 or outbound 21. You can look for things like bytes coming in are equal to bytes going out. That's an important one, because that's usually somebody using a tunnel against you. Dynamic DNS. You can also look for other types of DNS queries. Unique user strings, unique URLs. And you've got your Windows logs. Windows logs, typically what you see people recommend is look for logon attempts, look for user added to privileged groups. But there's a lot more you can actually look for. You can look at modifications to the system, modifications to some of the services. You've got your antivirus logs. I mean, they're there. You might as well use them. It'll weed out some of the noise. You also look for process maps, all running on a system versus privileged execution. You might also start to deploy endpoint detection solutions, so reporting some kind of indicators, reporting forensics information, and you basically logging of general events. But again, you're generating a lot of data. So either you feed this into a SIM, or you're going to feed this into ELK. So I've done this on QRadar, ArcSight, Splunk, and we're now building an Elasticsearch backend as well. But to be honest, most of the SIMs are based on, have been created with one thing in mind: managing network logs. So they're very network focused. So if you look at things like ArcSight and QRadar, the default configuration is very network focused. Don't try and pipe endpoint data into QRadar. You can, but it's a mess. I know, I've just spent the last 6 months doing it. I can show you the mess. Splunk is really good, because Splunk is not really a SIM. So if you guys use Splunk, you know that Splunk really isn't a SIM. It's actually more of a log management tool, and it's more of a log search tool. And if you take Elasticsearch and Logstash, you can basically do the same thing for free. And I kind of find the Elasticsearch regex parameters a little bit more interesting than Splunk. But Splunk's got some really good new interface as well in the new version. It's all about really, you need to take that data and somehow process it and look at it and see how you can identify things. Now, some people will tell you you should orient your searches. You know, does everybody recognize the yellow one? That's the kill chain, as defined by whatchamacallit? No, who is it? What the hell's the name of the company? Huh? Yaqid, thank you. Then you got the MITRE attack chain, which is a little bit more, it explores a little bit more the different phases once they're inside. That lower diagram is some of the execution workflow that MITRE kind of recognizes. But my problem with this is that it's interesting. It's a good picture when you're talking to management to explain to them what you found. But the fact of the matter is that recon can go to persistence. It doesn't have to go through escalation, right? Depending on what kind of information you've got inside. And then you get all this mess because everything can go everywhere anyway. Attackers do not follow a timeline. They do not follow these 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. It's not A plus B plus C. It's A, D, E, F. But from the endpoint point of view and from a data protection point of view, what I'm looking at is this part. What I really want to know is that part, right? How they got in is interesting because then I can stop them from getting in. But did they actually take anything? Did they touch anything? That's more interesting for me. So I don't really believe in this. And one of my colleagues who runs the team, he really believes in this. I don't. I think it's a bit of a waste of time because you're forcing yourself into boxes. I'd much prefer to actually look at things and say, okay, I think, this guy's doing this, he's going to go this here next, and there next. If you're doing it right, you can actually start to predict what your attackers are going to do, because you'll start to see patterns, right? You'll start to see the way that they work, especially if it's a sustained attack and if it's a very targeted attack. There's other tempting things as well. Because you're generating so much data, you might want to fall back on certain other aspects to help you analyze that data. Behavior analytics is talked about a lot. I have a problem with end-user behavioral analytics. The problem I have with end-user behavioral analytics is it's really good if you have a very static workforce. If you have a very mobile workforce, they do not behave in a regular pattern, right? They'll be logging on from home, they'll be logging on from a different country, they might be in the UK today, tomorrow they might be in Vienna, the following day they might be in Prague. I mean, this week I basically did London, Prague, Vienna, and I'll be back in London on Sunday. But the point is user behavior analytics, you're looking for a steady pattern of work, right? So you're looking for a person connecting at 8 o'clock, disconnecting at 5 o'clock, doing application X during the day, going to this server during the day, and things like that. And user behavior analytics basically says, well, I'll build this pattern match. If I see something different from that person's machine, from that person's user account, then that's an anomaly, and I'll report it. If that person doesn't have a regular pattern, it's very difficult to find anomalies. Situational awareness. This is, for me, is probably one of the more important things. If you do regular risk assessments, you can actually identify your critical assets, and you can focus what you're looking for on those critical assets. If you start to focus on your critical assets, you're giving a better level of protection. However, you're missing what's going on the side. So if you focus too much on your critical assets, suddenly your side, something's happening outside of that perimeter of critical assets, and they're getting in, and they're sitting there waiting. And then suddenly you get an attack that's been going on for months, and you didn't know where it came from because your focus was too narrow. So you can't really focus. Intelligence-driven. There's a lot of solutions that claim to be threat hunting, but ultimately they rely a lot on IOCs, TTPs, and feeds. They allow you to add TTPs, but at the end of the day, they're really relying on that thing. You do need intelligence, don't get me wrong, but you can't rely on it 100%. Machine learning is probably one of the best solutions that can come out of this, mostly because I'm actually looking at machine learning right now. If you can build a model where you're going to start to identify the baseline, you're going to start to identify that normal level of activity, you can start to look at peaks and variations in those peaks. And potentially, if you can teach your engine well enough, you'll start to pull out things that are interesting, like certain use cases, like sticky key attack or like PowerShell being used in a malicious way. But ultimately, yes, we have cats. Eyes not stalking, just intensely staring, right? It is about eyes on screen, right? There's nothing better than a pair of eyes attached to a brain. We can think better than any computer. Well, I might have to rephrase that statement following the election on Tuesday. Sorry, European joke. I should talk. I live in Britain, so you know, we started the trend. But the fact of the matter is, if you're building a team to do this, their eyes and their brain are what's going to matter, because they will start to see regular behavior in what they're seeing on their screen, and they will be able to start to see anomalies. And if you build your dashboards properly, if you build your viewing environment properly, you'll start to be able to pick things up. Now, a lot of people talk about, well, how do I do this? How do I effectively look at things? Well, that's a big problem, right? We tend to have a preconceived notion, right? So you might see SSH traffic on a network device, and you think, oh, okay, that's just SSH traffic. But are you really looking at the direction? Are you really looking at what application is doing that SSH traffic? Because that's what's going to matter. And we tend to glance over things and kind of miss things because we're not looking at it properly. And I started reading this book called Visual Intelligence, Sharpen Your Perception. And it's from a person called Amy Herman. So she runs a class called The Art of Perception. Essentially what she discusses is how we miss things that are right in front of us, that we need to kind of step back and reanalyze things, right? She compares it to looking at art. Basically, when you look at a picture, you see the picture. If you sit there long enough, you'll start to see the details of the picture, like the brush strokes, like a little person in the window, and things like that. So she's put that into kind of like a methodology on how you can actually look at things better. And she teaches it to police and to investigators because it's a better way to actually do crime scene investigation. So the first step that she recommends is you assess things. So you look at what you're seeing, you kind of just try to describe it, and then you say, okay, I've described it. Now I'm going to analyze it. Can I speak this? Can I actually put this into my own words? If yes, can I then articulate it? Can I articulate it to you so that it means something to you? Of what I'm getting the same picture from two versions of what I'm seeing. Then you adapt that discussion to actually go back and look at it again. So now you have a starting point for looking at the information a second time. And when you start to look at the information a second time, you can start to think, okay, I've seen this before. What's different from what I've seen before? So you can start to articulate. So you start to say, well, I've seen this activity on port 22. It looks like normal network traffic, but it's coming from a user in admin. Okay? Then you can ask, why is the user in admin doing SSH traffic? So you can go back and then look for more evidence and re-articulate that whole description. Once you start to think in that way, you can start to see things differently. You can start to pick up things. The logs take a different view because you're no longer looking just at, oh, I see port 22 traffic. You're actually starting to associate, I have a user who's using this application on port 22 in this context, right? And that's what basically you want to build when you're actually looking for threats. You're trying to understand that aspect of what is happening on that endpoint, or what is happening on that network device. Oops. So I thought I saw many putty cats. You're not going to be looking for one thing, right? Because in an organization, you have thousands of endpoints potentially, hundreds to thousands to hundreds of thousands. So if you start to bring in endpoint data, well, what are we going to look for? Well, we're going to look for processes, yes, because that's what runs on an endpoint. You're going to look, you need to understand, when you're looking for your processes, what are your standard processes that you have on a machine? How many of you work for organizations with a standard image? Probably a lot of you, right? Or you've worked with organizations with standard images. Many organizations use standard images because it's easier to support. That means that there's a set defined set of processes that run in normal situation. Look for the ones that don't belong. So find out why there's different processes installed. Privilege execution. Privilege execution is interesting because there should only be a very small amount of processes that actually run in an admin account or run as a system account. Do you know what they are? It's like, can you identify them? Are you sure that they're the right ones? Find out which third-party applications abuse this. There's a lot of third-party applications that will actually use privilege escalation or ask for privilege escalation to do things. Why? They shouldn't be. If they are, you should probably be getting rid of them. Find out which users run as local admin. Because if a user runs as local admin, he has the power to actually change that machine. And if that account gets compromised, the attacker has the power to change that machine as well. Network activity. Do you know which processes actually listen? There are very few processes on an endpoint, unless it's a server, that actually listen on the network. So you need to understand that and look for other ports that are being listened on. Which processes should make network connections? Again, very few. There's a couple of service host processes, probably some of your Internet Explorer, Chrome, things like that. But if you see C-script doing a connection to the internet, that's probably abnormal, right? That's probably something you're going to highlight and you want to start your investigation on. We're going to start looking for. Are the local firewalls enabled? Do you know what filters are in place? Are the filters being avoided? Do you know that it's actually quite easy to turn off the local firewall on Windows? If you have the right command, you can do it by command line. So if you start looking for that command line that changes the firewall settings, well, that's a good start. I mean, somebody's messing around with the firewall. Somebody's messing around with what they're doing. You can get more system information as well. You need to understand some of the drivers that are running on your machines. So if you have, a standard image and you have a standard hardware, you should be able to identify all the most of the driver DLLs and most of the services that run to support the hardware. Why is this important? Actually, believe it or not, if you read the analysis of stuckness, they actually use kernel drivers to bypass security and to get in. Persistence is not just the run key. So persistence, most people think, they put something in run key or they did an act command. There's actually a lot more. You can change the links in Explorer, the default links in Explorer. You can add things in services. Scheduled tasks is a good way of obfuscating and hiding tracks. Basically, I come into the machine. Okay, I'm in. Now, I'm going to schedule a task on on the machine to run, say, 2 days later. I delete my initial connection from the logs. 2 days later, I get a call back to my attack environment, but I've disassociated that original attack from my actual execution phase, right? So I can hide myself a little bit longer. I can delay the detection. Do you know what services are running on the image, right? It's really easy, it can be really easy to add services if you have the right commands and the right access. And that's another way of creating forms of persistence and long-term residence. I said this earlier, the target of an attacker is the data, right? Don't fool yourself. They are after your data. There's probably 2 reasons they're after your data. One, to delete it or to stop you from using it, denial of service on data. 2, to exfiltrate it. So depending on what your company is and how bad what they feel like they can do for you, do to you, they will either exfil it or block you from using it. Ransomware is a type of denial of service if you think about it. They're stopping you from using your data. Exfiltration, well, I'm not going to go back through all the exfiltrations. I heard this morning there was a good one. Marcus Random said that, the Snowden thing was a BYOD attack, right? But ultimately, what was he after? The data. Collect the configuration. If you know the configuration, if you have a baseline configuration, you can start to analyze them over time. So you pull your baseline configuration, then you keep pulling regularly configuration, and you can see the changes in the configuration. So you can actually find things that are going on. You can use WMI to do that, for example. You can see what's changed in the registries, what's changed in the run programs. You can pull as many typical indicators as possible. So most endpoint solutions will allow you to pull the common indicators of compromise. And if you get alerts on those, they're always good starting points. But the negative thing is if you start to collect all this data, you're going to generate a lot of data. I've played with some of the solutions, and in a day, you can basically generate 10 gigabytes of data for one machine if you do a lot of stuff on it. So you need to think about what you're doing and parameterize it. Yeah, headaches. So what's available in terms of endpoints? So this is a snapshot about 9 months ago. There's probably a couple missing. I'm not going to go through them. It's basically, that's the kind of data you can get out of these different endpoint solutions in terms of what you can actually use to analyze. You've also got IOC triggers on a lot of these. Some of them have the ability to capture files, to capture event logs, to pull back WMI data. It's data. The more data you have, the more fun you can have. You can get strings as well. Strings is always fun to play with, but it's a lot of data. What you're actually looking for is basically to be able to build a list of scripts, well, a list of applications, what they're doing. Are they doing network? Are they doing file manipulations? Are they downloading files? Are they saving files? So you can reassociate this in your hunt. And you can get more evidence. So things like, so this is like scripts that are running, so connections to a website, downloading of a file. Then you have more things like changes of registries. This is all data that you can use in a hunt. So, when I was thinking about what I was doing, so this is actually an interesting command. It's basically a bash script that does a for on every drive letter looking for all data documents. It's actually part of a ransomware. But essentially, these are the type of stuff you're looking for, because that's where you're going to go look for things, right? Command lines are one of the biggest things that you can use in threat hunting, mostly because they're using the tools that are readily available in the system against you, right? There's no additional malware. There's just the basic CMD, the basic PowerShell, the basic library tools available in system. This one is 7-zip masquerading as AO.exe and then encrypting the files. So things you look for. One of the things that I'm still looking at, and I talked about this a little bit last year, is that enabling behavioral analysis at the endpoint is really important, because we need to start thinking about how we're going to put that data back into context. If you have to do it manually, it's really difficult. But if you're able to actually build intelligent alerts coming out of or intelligent data packets coming out of the endpoint, you can start to look for things more faster and better. So using the endpoint, we can drive behavioral analysis, watch the activities and record, and then send real-time information, not just collect stale data. We can highlight the pertinent events and get more interesting data, so you can actually call back and pull up the forensics events if you need to. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter what you use. What you need is a set of logs, you need data, so that you can start looking for the threat, right? You need to microscope your threat. So, visualize and analyze the data, right? So this is stuff that we look for, and we got in Splunk. So here, these are network operations we're looking for. We're looking for network operations that might have triggered on a threat feed. So we do use threat feeds. It's very useful. It helps to highlight. These are Explorer launches that aren't in the normal places where you would see Explorer being launched, or the normal way you'd see Explorer being launched. So this is all data that we're kind of regrouping to be able to see. Service host executing in a suspicious manner. So these are service hosts not running in System 32 or running in a different folder. Then we have things like PowerShell attacks. So we're looking for PowerShell strings and what they're attacking the data, win logon. So that was Splunk. These are some of the things that you might look for, right? What you need to do is you need to get really competent in regex. Trust me. You need to understand regex really well. You need to have good skills. So very long URIs. So typically, malware attacks or ransomware attacks or those types of attacks, they have, even if you actually analyze Metasploit, if you look at some of the Metasploit modules, they communicate over HTTPS, but if you look at the URL, it's freaking long, right? And it's all just like hexadecimal characters. That's stuff that we look for. We look for it because, well, it's interesting. It's not a normal web application URI. User agent strings are useful too. Although a competent attacker will actually change his user agent string to look like a normal IE or a Chrome. DGAs and the domain age is also important. It's interesting. The DNS domain age is interesting to look at. File execution location, so where the file is executing from. If it's executing from things like app data temp or a bin or other bin locations that are not normal bin locations, bin I mean by trash, you're kind of suspicious. Network ports. It's my favorite. It's like looking for an application that's communicating out in port 80. We found one thing where we had one attack where they used an exploit in regserve32, and suddenly we saw regserve32 communicating out to the internet on port 80. Why the hell does regserve32 do network connections anyway? Right? It shouldn't. I mean, that's what you're looking for. Command lines. Who am I? Net user, hostname, IP config. That's somebody trying to find out who they are in terms of user counts. Net view, net stat, net use mount. That's lateral movement preparation. Launch control, SC, service, net start, task list, PS-A. You're looking for services. You're looking for ways to execute things. At schedule task, cron tab, trying to add persistence. And there's a whole list. I mean, I just put some of the common ones that you might want to look for. These are some of the things that we found. So the top report there is the RDP sticky key. So if you've ever heard of that one, basically you replace the sticky key so that in the logon you just hit the shift key a few times and you get a pop-up, in this case CMD, and you can reset the password of the admin because you're running a system. The bottom one is PowerShell exploit. It's a really simple one, but basically it's PowerShell is downloading a file and it's copying it to A and then running it. The actual original, we decrypted this one because the original one is actually obfuscated a little bit. They're using PowerShell obfuscation techniques. These are some of the regexes that we look for. So things like the top one is password dumping solutions. Believe it or not, we find end users using these. It's not just external parties, right? We've actually caught end users using these types of tools to escalate their privilege internally in the organization and spy on other users. Literally, they were spying on other users, including their managers. Okay? It's not really, it's not the best thing you want to have. The bottom one is use of WMI to do things like installation of tools or installation of malware. We got the little one on the right is adding yourself to a local admin group. CSRS not running as NT authority. And the problem is that once you start to get international, you have to put the freaking thing in on. Try reggae. It's a real pain in the ass. Why can't they just use one username? Then CRS running in a different path. This one, the guy who wrote this was a little bit of, I told him, you can write this better. It's like, why? It works. Okay. But single character executable. Most executables do not have a single character. Okay. You can link this to threat feeds. So here we're actually linking it to VirusTotal. So what this does is, you won't use this normally in a threat hunt. What we do with this is we actually read out the malware, or we can use it as a starting point. Because if we see that the malware is like some kind of remote admin tool or rat, then we go, oh, that's interesting. So we go back and actually investigate the rest of the flow. If it's just adware, we can basically just leave it alone and just send it out to the help desk and they can fix whatever. We also look a lot for data attacks. So this one I highlighted is deletion of volume shadow copies. That wasn't a ransomware attack. A lot of ransomwares, what they'll do is if they see very shallow copies, they'll delete them. So you might not see this might be a brand new piece of ransomware, so you don't know what it looks like. But that's indicative that they're playing with the data, they're trying to play with the data, so we investigate. So this is ArcSight. Then you can link it. If you have a response tool, you can say, I found this, so let's quarantine that machine. You probably want to do this because then you can actually open a ticket and go have the real IR, the local IR team actually go down and investigate the machine from a local perspective. The thing with threat hunting is you're not necessarily going to go through a full IR process. What you're trying to do is you're trying to identify something happening in your environment to quickly stop it, but also to actually instantiate a proper incident response process. It's another one with blacklisting IP addresses. So the cat's winning in this. Preparation. So you need to build a team, usually. The best resources are the guys that already know how to do IR, who already know how to identify things. You need to give them time to do things, build the plan and document the tools and things like that, build the documentation, build up the knowledge of the organization. One thing that's interesting is I had this question a couple of weeks ago. It's like, how do I, because if you remember at the beginning, I said that it's creativity and adapt. You need to be able to adapt because that's what the attackers do. So from the team perspective, you need to find people that are creative, that can adapt, that don't think logically, that don't think outside of the box. So there are cognitive tests to actually identify the type of thinker that a person is. I don't think I'd go as far. I just give everybody a chance because you'd never know what would happen. But it was a question. Start small. Focus on one area of your organization. You usually find something. Refine the process. Move to wider hunts. So build up that experience. Build up that knowledge on how to do it. And as you build up your knowledge, you're building your baseline of how things work in your organization. You need to motivate the teams because believe me, staring at logs all freaking day is not fun. Just debug an application. If you debug an application, it's the same thing, but you're doing it 24/7. Motivate your hunters. So I've heard teams successfully using like a CTF. So whoever finds something first gets an Amazon gift certificate, things like that. I've heard this used a few times in different threat hunting. We have a bonus scheme, so the best thing that you find, you get the bonus of the month. Get executive buy-in. So eventually you need to embed this into the process of your incident response, and you need to actually validate this. So you need to get executive buy-in. That's the hardest part, to be honest, because you're basically telling them, we're going to have a team of 5 people that's going to sit and shift through logs all day. That's a waste of time. But if you explain to them that they're actually looking at your environment and they're building that organizational knowledge, they're building that footprint, they're doing a gap analysis at the same time, they're like, ooh, wait, you just saved me a bunch of auditors, right? Doing a gap analysis on your infrastructure usually costs money. But if the guys are doing it anyway because they need to understand what's critical and what's not critical, you basically win. Augment skill set. So teaching the business process and things like that is important. Understanding the business process, being able to help the guys build a hypothesis and move from that logic of A plus B plus C to something completely different. There's no way to teach it, but there's a way to kind of demonstrate it if you learn by experience, sort of thing. One of the things that I find the hardest is that so we do this for our customers, and it's really hard because we don't have that organizational knowledge. So what we found is we've actually had to kind of assign a lead analyst to each organization. He spends the most time on an organization, or on a customer, so that he understands, but he starts to see the regular patterns, and he can start to build the regexes that are good. Yeah, I've finished. I have. This is the conclusion. So, I mean, threat hunting, it's really interesting, right? You can do a lot of things with it, but it's just a refocusing of your IR process. So if you have an IR process and you're happy with it, you probably don't need this. If you think you're being attacked regularly and you don't know, this is probably one way to start looking for things. The thing is, if you think about threat hunting, you're putting the priority on identification. You're trying to identify as much as possible. The benefits that you get is you start to look at how you can minimize that footprint of attack. And you're starting to remove those dark holes because you're doing that gap analysis, you're building that organizational knowledge. And finally, detecting the breaches yourself. I think there's a lot of customers would be happy, and for what we do, there's a lot of customers would be happy if when we detect the breaches, because it didn't get detected by the FBI. Or it didn't get leaked to the newspapers. That's it. So I hope this is a good overview of threat hunting, and it gives you some insight into what it is and how hard it can be. Don't wake up. Yay, we have Mike. The little light's on.
Now it's on, yes. So we have a few minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I will come with the mic so we get the questions on tape as well. I think there are probably a few questions, like what is regex? So no.
Which one? The one that I think should be done better. I've actually done it better for another thing.
So while you're thinking about your questions, I got actually one. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that you have to define what normal is.
Yeah.
How often would you define what normal is? Once a year, once a month, every day? Because it looks rather complicated.
So defining normal, it is complicated because in most cases, you'll start to build a pattern after about a month. You'll start to see, 2 months, let's be generous, 2 months, because you'll start to see the ups and downs of the way the applications work, the way users work. The problem is if you have a very dynamic business, defining normal changes regularly. So you're starting with a baseline and you're basically building on that. It's like a Lego. It's like you start to build your wall, you start to build your road with Lego, and then suddenly you see it turns left, it turns right, comes back on itself. But the idea is that you're understanding those patterns because you will see patterns. We're still talking about IT here, so you still have a structured system, right? You still have systems that work logically. So you still will see that these applications are being used, these are the applications, this is the ports that are being used, these are the IP addresses that we go to. Once you start going out to the internet, it's a little bit more complicated, but internally, if you're focusing on the endpoint, the internal stuff is probably more important to baseline because they are looking to get into your internal systems. So if you understand the way that normal activity should happen on the internal systems, then you're better off. So typically, things that don't change is finance at the end of the month doing their reporting. So you see a lot of activity going maybe to SAP from the finance teams, and that's kind of normal activity you're looking for. But let's say you see on the 15th, the weekend of around the 15th, you start to see a lot of activity going to SAP from a finance workstation. That's probably not normal, right? So it doesn't mean that it's not valid. What you need to do is you need to investigate. So you need to find out, is the user actually working? Is there something that's being changed in finance that makes them work on the 15th? If not, then you know that there's an attack going on.
So anyone else? Can't be always me asking questions. Yes?
Do you have any tips for doing threat modeling in an IT company? Because I would say that maybe some of these indicators that you mentioned are more or less typical in an IT company where people on servers do such stuff, maybe during development or so, but these could also be attacked.
Yeah. When I find an answer to that one, I'll tell you about it. Because we're an IT company, right? So we develop our own software. We run this stuff, but our data is going into the same analysis, threat hunting analysis backend. What we you still can build patterns, right? We'll see in our organization, we see that there's the developer activity on the dev servers and things like that, and the Git check-ins and check-outs. They happen on a regular basis, a certain part of the month. When we start to get close to release date, it goes up. And that's defining normal. Basically, you'll see normal activity, but let's say you start to see a lot of pulls from your Git. You start to see pulls every day from old versions, old streams, from a machine that's not supposed to be pulling. One of the things that we look for developers is we look for what happens after they do the Git pull, for example. What do they do with the local cache? Do they zip it? That's unusual. Do they upload it via SFTP? That's not normal. That's when we start to get concerned. So defining normal is about understanding the way the business works as well. So if you do have an IT company, you're basically going to say, what do my developers normally do during the day, right? And you'll see it. I mean, we've seen it. So we do have a few customers that do a lot of source code, and we've seen typically what we'll see is that somebody will pull the source code and start to try to exfiltrate it via methods like zipping or SFTP and things like that. That's when we start to alert, mostly because that's when it's becoming critical. It's very difficult to differentiate. The other thing too is modifying code outside of office hours, right? I mean, we're in Europe, let's face it. Most normal developers won't work outside of office hours, right? So if you start to see somebody modifying source code outside of office hours, it's probably, potentially malicious.